in the philosophy department. This is the third session in the Values in Technology Conference, which I understand has been admirably put together by my colleagues Tony Smith and Fred Evans, and probably others that I'm not aware of, but those two at least deserve credit. Our speaker tonight is Ruth Schwartz Cowan, who wrote this wonderful book, More Work for Mother. And it's all about the ironies of household technology, from the open hearth to the microwave. And I can't say that I've read it carefully from cover to cover, but I have been looking through it more and more the last several days. And one of the subjects that Professor Cowan takes up in her work is the common idea that we have that women in the household have less work today because of modern technologies like the microwave and the washing machine and the refrigerator and so on. And she includes in her history wonderful pictures of early laundry machines and follows them right up into the present. And reading this and thinking about it made me remember as a child fond memories of going to the laundromat with my mother and sitting in the middle of a Chicago February winter right next to the dryer, and then jumping down and chasing my sister and my brother around the little aisles of the laundromat. My mother was in town this weekend, and as I was talking to her about Professor Cowan coming and talking to us and my reflecting about doing laundry, I asked her about that and asked her if she had as pleasant memories as I did about that. She said, "Gary, do you know how often I went to the laundromat?" I said, "No." She said, "We had 4 children between the ages of 2 and 8 we had 4 children in diapers, 2 children in diapers for at least 4 years. I went to the laundromat every day." So thinking about Professor Cowan's thesis that we haven't really gotten anywhere, I said, "How often did Grandma do business on her farm, laundry on her farm up in Mason City?" And Mom thought about it and she said, "Every day." And then I started thinking about Karen and my household. And Mom turned to me and said, "How often do you guys do laundry?" "Every day." Professor Cowan can explain why we typically think household chores have gotten easier, when in fact it's not clear that they have at all. She is professor in the history department at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She recently was the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities and Social Sciences Division at California Institute of Technology. We've asked her to speak on the topic of gender and technology, and she'll come soon to do that. As soon as I tell you that she has a new book just out that she has co-authored with her husband, Neil Cowan, called Our Parents' Lives, and it's an oral history of Eastern European immigrant Jews. Professor Cowan has also been the director of Women's Studies at Stony Brook until this year, and with that, I welcome her to Iowa State.
I'm going to experiment for a few minutes because this is a somewhat weird room. Can you hear me reasonably well without that? I have to use it. Okay. If there's an echo that comes this way, which means I hear myself twice. So if I begin to sound a little silly, it's because I'm hearing myself twice. Technology and gender is the subject that I agreed to speak on tonight. And having spoken on that subject a lot in the last 15 years, I know that most people find it a really strange juxtaposition of terms. So part of what I'm going to try to do tonight is ask why we find it such a strange juxtaposition of terms. It's the business of scholars to look, I think, at strange juxtapositions of terms, of intersections between categories that most people just slide by, never even noticing that they intersect with each other or not caring that they intersect with each other. We could be here for several hours, which I hope we won't be, if I started to tell you how I began to get interested in this strange intersection where technology and gender meet. But it's that intersection that I chose to talk about tonight, and the technique, the rubric that I'm going to use to talk about it is, in a way, to create in my mind, in your minds, I hope, the image of an intersection, a place where roads meet each other, and ask, what does this intersection where gender and technology meet look like? What's in it? What's it populated by? How can I describe the landscape, this place that I've spent a lot of time looking at, which most people until recently didn't spend a lot of time looking at? What does it look like? And why bother spending time looking at that intersection between those strange categories? And in describing that intersection to you, the principal thing among several other sub-principal things that I'm going to try to do is explicate why that intersection sounds and looks strange to most people. So let me start by being definitive, at least about something. What do we mean, or what do I mean when I say technology? What do I mean when I say gender? Some of you may be familiar with one or both of those, one of either of those terms, but not both. So very quickly, for those of you who don't know why we talk about gender these days instead of talking about sex, which is what we talked about when I was starting out on this scholarly enterprise, gender can best be defined by an analogy. Gender is to culture as sex is to biology. Or gender is the cultural trappings that every culture has written sort of on top of the fundamental sex differences. There are two sexes and a couple of intersexes, and those are biologically defined or biologically determined. They are biological differences between people, but gender is something else. Gender are the social creations that we human beings make around those biological differences. That on the whole in our culture, women can wear these days skirts or pants, but men can't wear skirts and pants. It's a cultural trapping. Attire is a gender characteristic. We talk about gender roles, meaning those things that the culture considers it appropriate for one sex to do, and those things that the culture thinks it's appropriate for another sex to do, knowing fully well that there are other cultures who define gender in different ways. There are some cultures in which women are thought to have a great deal of upper body strength, and as a consequence of that, or we think as a consequence of that, water carrying is a job that women do. And there are other cultures, ours is one of them, in which women are thought to not have very much upper body strength. That's the reason why girls can't, play football as well as boys can, because boys have big chests and they can lift things. Those are gender characteristics. They are cultural characteristics that we construct as a culture on top of or in between or underneath the differences that biology has created. So it is no longer fashionable, as some of you may know, to talk about women's studies. In fact, the program that I directed until this year, which was called a Women's Studies program until this year, is soon going to be renamed as a Gender Studies program. And it's no longer fashionable in certain circumstances to talk about sex roles. We talk about gender roles. So much for gender. Technology, I interpret more broadly than most people interpret technology. It's those combinations of artifacts, that is, objects or natural resources that have been altered by humans, that we use, that we create and use in order to achieve our goals. Most of my students, when I ask them, and I always do at the beginning of the semester when I teach courses in the history of technology, I say, what is technology? And they write down things like automobiles, computers, never a dishwasher, only automobiles and computers. Every once in a while, a microwave oven gets on the list. But the definition that I've given you is a little broader than that because it can include things like bridges and buildings, which most people don't think of as technologies, but which are. But it can also include things like calendars, which are human constructs that we make out of natural resources, the motions of the heavenly bodies that nature provides us with, in order to achieve certain goals. That is, to be able to know what day you have to pay your taxes on, or on what day the guy down the river is going to arrive with a shipment of apple cider or whatever it is he's shipping. So technology is not just modern things that we'd like to buy to put in our homes and offices. It's all those combinations of artifacts that we put together in order to accomplish our goals. And I have to point out to you, although it's a digression from what I'm going to talk about tonight, that historians of technology get very upset when people talk about the present day as a technological age. All ages of human history have been technological ages because as far back as we can know anything about human beings, they have fashioned tools in order to help them achieve their goals. A stone spear is as much a technology as a computer is. Human beings are naturally, it appears, technological. It may be true that technology is changing faster in our day than it used to change, and it may also be true that we are much more dependent on each other because of our technologies than people used to be. But it's not because we've got more of it, it's because it's different. Now that I've said definitive things, defining my two terms, I'm going to start trying to describe the intersection in which these two terms meet. Now, 15 years ago, I was asked to do the same thing, that is, describe this intersection for a bicentennial meeting of the Society for the History of Technology, in which all of us folks were being asked, because it was the bicentennial year, to take a long view and a broad view of our subject. And I wrote a paper then in which I tried to look at this same intersection. What do we mean? What are we talking about when we talk about gender and technology? And what I found then was a very desolate landscape in that intersection. There wasn't very much there. and it was very quiet. There were 3 roads that ran into that intersection, but there weren't very many cars on them. 15 years ago, when I looked over the subject of gender and technology, I discovered that as scholars whose specialty this field was, that is not gender and technology, but the history of technology, we didn't know anything much about the technologies that are unique to each sex. And I've deliberately used the word sex there and not gender. Clearly, men are different biologically from women, and that means that there are some pieces of equipment that are uniquely designed to serve women's biological needs, and there are other pieces of equipment that are uniquely designed to serve men's biological needs. And as historians, we knew virtually nothing about them. We knew lots, for example, about the birth control movement, but virtually nothing about birth control devices. How had people managed to restrict their fertility in 1900 when the birth rate in this country was going down? Nobody knew what they used to do it. We didn't know anything about the history of the condom, to give you a similar example. We knew nothing about the history of the baby bottle, which is, for most purposes, a replacement for a uniquely female sexual characteristic. And that was the first avenue that I found rather desolate. Historians of technology had written books on some pretty abstruse and not very commonly encountered technologies. In 1976, you could have found out more than you ever wanted to know, for example, about the history of the bicycle. You could have found out an enormous amount about the history of the open-heart blast furnace, but you couldn't find out anything about the history of the diaphragm or the condom. Second avenue. We didn't know much about the technologies that were connected to the work that was uniquely female. For example, washing machines and typewriters. Diapers, which are, after all, a technology. Things that were connected to the work that is in our culture or in other cultures generally assigned to women and not to men, that is, gendered work. If the gender that was assigned to that work was women, then we knew virtually nothing about the history of the equipment with which women did that work. And similarly, we knew virtually nothing about the impact that those technologies had had on the work that women do. There were a couple of exceptions to this rule, that is, that we didn't know much. We knew lots about the history of the sewing machine, but what we knew about it was the male part of it. That is, we knew who had invented it, and we knew who had produced it, and we knew a lot about the factories in which it was produced, and we knew a lot about the competition between the various inventors of it. But compared to what we knew about the male part of the sewing machine, we knew next to nothing about the impact of the sewing machine on the workers who ended up working with it, whether they worked at home or in factories or in tailors' shops. We knew virtually nothing. Finally, the third avenue, which was very quiet and untraveled by, was the avenue that was about women who have created new technologies, whether in roles as inventors or in roles as engineers. We knew virtually nothing about women inventors, and even less about women engineers in 1976, except that on superficial examination there didn't seem to be many of them to know anything about. And that's what I mean when I tell you, by way of beginning this examination, that 15 years ago I could map out what roads were leading into the intersection. But I couldn't say very much about those roads, and I could say virtually nothing about the intersection because it was so desolate, because there was so little there, because there was so little conversation or activity on those roads or in that intersection. Well, a lot of traffic has passed through that intersection in the intervening 15 years. And my task tonight, at least in part, is to tell you something about what that traffic's been like. If I look at the intersection now, it's crowded. It's filled with books and journal articles written by scholars. It's filled with some books and magazine articles written by journalists and not by scholars. It's not crammed, mind you, but there's a lot more there than there was 15 years ago. And it's not quiet anymore. It's become, in modern academic parlance, a contested terrain. A lot of people are arguing. A lot of the argument is, in my judgment, hot air. So the intersection tends to be a bit windy. You have to flip through a lot of pages of wind to find out what's about and doing in this intersection. But once you've gotten through the wind, to continue in the same visual metaphor that I've been using, there are some pretty solid structures in this intersection now, and some pretty solid structures that line the roads that are leaning up to it. There are some things that we can say more definitively we know than I was able to say 15 years ago that I could say I knew. There are lots of people milling around in this intersection now. There are economists who care a lot about technological change because it's part of the fuel that, when it's burning nicely, makes our economy grow. There are a lot of sociologists because sociologists, particularly those who specialize in the sociology of work, are really concerned, as they weren't 15 years ago, about what happens to people when new technologies come into their lives. There are a lot more philosophers on these roads than there used to be 15 years ago, including some who teach here. There are even a few deans of engineering schools in this intersection because it's become apparent to them that gender is something they have to do something about, and that it's getting increasingly difficult to do it. Every once in a while, as I look over these roads in this intersection, I even encounter an industrialist or entrepreneur along the way, though I sometimes suppose that the industrialists and entrepreneurs are in cars that are being driven by their daughters. Nonetheless, they are there and occasionally have something to say on the subject as well. So what do the avenues look like now? What does the intersection look like now? I haven't got enough time, actually, to describe all the avenues to you, so I'm going to start this section of my talk by very quickly telling you about the ones that I'm not going to say much about. We know a lot more about the uniquely female and uniquely male technologies today than we did 15 years ago. There's a whole book now on the history of the baby bottle. There are a raft of journal articles for what some of you, I hope, will realize are obvious reasons about the history of the condom. We even know much more about the history of birth control devices than we did 15 years ago. And because of various other new technologies, it's unlikely that that particular avenue will ever, or at least not for the foreseeable future, be desolate again. All kinds of things are changing about reproductive technologies. Literally, I have been reading a lot of newspapers in the last week because I usually don't get to read the newspaper except when I'm on airplanes, and I've been on airplanes a lot in the last week, and I can tell you that between Sunday and Tuesday, that is today, sort of losing track of time, there have been 5 articles in the New York Times about new reproductive technologies or aspects of new reproductive technologies. So it's unlikely that all the things that are coming down the pike are going to be as unexamined as some of the things that came down the pike 10, 15, 30 years ago. Indeed, that's the area in which I'm myself doing my own research now, and I can tell you that there's a lot of activity on that avenue right now. But I'm not going to talk about it terribly much tonight. We also know a lot more about the technologies that women use when they are engaged in what's called market labor, that is, when they're getting paid for their work. 15 years ago, for example, I could assert definitively that we didn't even know the history of the typewriter, let alone the impact of the typewriter on the work that people do. Now there is an entire book on the history of the typewriter, and furthermore, there have been numerous studies in the sociological literature about what happened not very long ago in printing industry when typography was computerized, and the typographers, who were almost entirely male, both in this country and in other countries, were replaced by females, by women, and when the keyboard on which typography was done was replaced by the QWERTY keyboard, the one that women know how to use. I offer that to you as only one example of a raft of studies that have been done in the last 15 years that look at the question of how women differ from men in the marketplace and how those differences affect both the introduction of new technologies into the workplace and the way in which people's work is affected by the introduction of those technologies. We now know, for example, that women differ from men as workers in several crucial characteristics, the most salient of which is that they get paid less and will work for less than men do, and the next most salient of which is that they tend to have less training and be willing to pursue less training than men do. And we now know enormous amounts, which is very difficult to summarize, and so I won't, about how those two characteristics, the ways in which women differ from men in the marketplace, affect the rate of technological change. Because after all, if you think about it, when businesses make a capital decision to invest a lot of money in a new technology, one of their principal reasons, not the only, but one reason for wanting to do it, is to make more money, and one way to make more money is to save on labor costs, and if you can replace expensive labor with less expensive labor, you save on labor costs, and one easy way to replace more expensive with less expensive labor is to replace men with women. So this process has been very carefully examined by a fairly large number of scholars, and if you want to learn more about it, I can recommend to you a book that I happen to have with me because I'm going to quote something from it later if I don't run out of time. Machinery of Dominance, it's called, and its subtitle is Women, Men, and Technical Know-How. It's by Cynthia Coburn. And it's an examination, a very careful and superbly well done examination of 4 different workplaces in which technological change has intersected with gender and what happens when that intersection occurs. The one thing that is clear from all of those studies, which I will refer to again as my talk goes on, is that gender segregation is a common phenomenon in the workplace, and technological change doesn't change it. Gender segregation means that women do some work and men do different work. That was true in the 19th century, and it remains true today. Sometimes, when you look at it from an historian's perspective, occupations change gender. There are some jobs that were once men's jobs that have become women's jobs. For example, typography, or the setting up in type of newspapers. Incidentally, we don't have any examples of jobs that were once women's jobs that have become men's jobs, with one exception, and that's the delivering of babies, which used to be midwifery, but which is now obstetrics. But there are lots of examples in which jobs change gender, but they still remain gendered. Because if you look at the workforce, you will discover that the vast majority of women are doing women's jobs. That is, the job they do is also done by a large number of other women, and the same is true for men. And that technological change does not alter that, although you would think that it might. If you really needed a lot of upper body strength to do a job, and they automated pulleys in the workplace, and you didn't need that strength any longer, you'd think, well, then maybe they'd split it up half and half. It would be half men and half women. Just go out on a construction site sometime and look at how much upper body strength it takes to drive the, what's it called, the thing with the big teeth that digs. Well, the Caterpillar is the company that makes it, but there's a specific name for the device. A steam shovel. Right? You don't need terribly much upper body strength to do that any longer, although you needed a lot of upper body strength to do it when you did it with a shovel. But women haven't started filtering into that occupation yet. There are, however, 2 roads that feed into this intersection that I am going to describe in somewhat more detail than I've let myself describe the road of uniquely gendered or uniquely sexed technologies and the technologies with which each gender does its work. And the first of those roads is the third of the ones that I mentioned when I was giving my earlier survey. And it's the road of, we might say, women engineers and inventors. 15 years ago, I thought part of the reason we didn't know much, or we thought that there had been so few women inventors and so few women engineers, was that nobody had looked carefully. I mean, this was in the early phases of women's history. We were discovering that there were women in all kinds of places that nobody had ever told us there were women before. And one of the heady, exciting things about women's history and women's studies, and in some fields it still is exciting, is the discovery of what women had done. And I thought 15 years ago that if only somebody looked hard enough and knew the places to look in, we'd find hordes of hidden women inventors and armies of unknown women engineers. Well, lots of people have been looking for 15 years. And a lot of ink has been spilled on this issue. And a lot of really weird stones have been turned over. And I have to tell you, the end result is that there aren't many. There wasn't anybody under some of those stones, or some of the people that were said to have been under those stones turned out to be fictions of various other people's imaginations. So that the interesting question on that road that leads to the intersection of gender and technology is why? And in exploring that road, let me just give you some data to give you some idea of what is so strikingly absent on that road. In 1986, which was the last year for which I could get the data, there were roughly 2,600,000 engineers in this country, about 4% of whom were women. 6 years before that, in 1980, there were 1,000,000, roughly 800,000 engineers, of whom 3% were female. So in those 6 years, the percentage of women engineers rose from 3 to 4%. Let's look at some other fields, or let me tell you about some other fields and what was happening in those fields at the same time. If we don't look at scientists, but we don't look at engineers, but we look at scientists. In 1980, 23.4% of all the scientists in the United States were female, and in 1986 that had gone up to 28.1%. But since the category of scientists lumps together everything from high-energy physicists to psychologists, let me separate it a little bit and tell you that for physical scientists, that is physicists and chemists, and I think also geologists are included in this figure, 10.3% of them were women in 1980 and 13.9% in 1986. Computer specialists, a category which includes programmers, were 28.7% female in 80 and 29.7 in 86. Now, I didn't think to put those on an overhead projector or find any other way to project them to you, so I'm going to just repeat them by way of emphasizing them. Only 4% of all the engineers in this country are women. And that can't be explained by what it's frequently explained by, the notion that women tend not to take as much math in high school and college as men do. Because if that were the explanation, then we would expect to find only 4 or 5% of all the scientists in the country being female. And instead it's 28 today, or in 86, the latest data is 28.1%. That is a little over a quarter of all scientists. And even if we wipe away those who are in the biological and psychological scientists and just look at physical scientists, there are still more physical scientists who are women than there are engineers. I'll just give you some other data to, again, continue to explore and emphasize how strikingly odd this figure is, that 4%. Some of you in this room are old enough to know that the real push for affirmative action in educational institutions began somewhere in the late 1960s. So in 1960, if we look at educational institutions and look at the degrees that they were granting, we see the following things. 5% of all the degrees in medicine in 1960 went to women. In 1986, the figure was 30%. It's not where people had hoped it would be, but it's a lot better than it used to be in that 26-year period. Same thing happened in law. 2.5% of all the law degrees in 1960 went to women, 39% went in 1986. In engineering, in 1960, 0.4%. A whole unit of difference, even for medicine and law. In 1986, that was up to 12.6%. Dentistry, which is the only other professional career, even anywhere as low in its percentage of women as engineering, was 0.8% in 1960. And it's gone up to 22% in 1986. This is the reason why I've said, repeating what a whole lot of other people have said, why I'm saying tonight, repeating what a whole lot of other people have said in other places, that either engineering and engineers are the most resistant to the incursion of women into their educational institutions and workplaces of all the professions, or, and both are equally possible, engineering is the least most attractive of all the professions to women. And either way, it's a possibility. Why should it be? Either that engineers are the most resistant, more resistant than lawyers and physicists and doctors and professors, or that engineering is so overwhelmingly unattractive. In fact, they probably influence each other in some way, but why should it be engineering that is the absolute pits as far as young girls, young women are concerned? Well, a lot of ink has been spilled over that question, not least of it in the journals in which engineering educators talk to each other, because they've been, at least some of the ones that I know of, working as hard at affirmative action, which may not be enormously hard or as hard as us folks in women's studies would like, but they've certainly been working at it as much as the medical schools and as much as the law schools, as much as the graduate schools of history or physics have been working at it, with the least results up to the present. So let me just tell you briefly what some of the answers to that question. I'm going to continue the metaphor. What are some of the answers to that question that have been coming down the pike in the last 15 years? Why are there so few? Why is there so much resistance in engineering? Or why is engineering so unattractive? Some say the answer is class. That is social class, not other kinds of class. That the young women with training adequate to become an engineer, that is, the young women who've taken all the math and science and computer science courses that one would need even to begin to contemplate going to engineering school or being an engineering major, tend to be middle class. And that engineering historically has attracted young people from the working classes, not the middle classes. So that, this argument goes, those young women who are willing and able go into science, go into medicine, they don't go into engineering. That's one possible explanation. Others say it's biology. The argument from biological determinism goes, for example, that women's brains are different from men's brains, and there are certain things that engineers need to be able to do, and on the whole, women can't do them too well, like be super good at spatial relations, on which it happens that young women tend to test slightly worse than young men do. It's one of the few aptitudes in which there is actually appears to be, even when you do a meta-analysis and regression analyses and try to wipe away all the variables, it seems to be one of the few aptitudes on which you can really see a difference, although it's not a very great difference. And so there are people who've been arguing that women's brains just don't suit them for the kinds of things that engineers have to do. Others say that it's the nature of the employment, that our engineers tend to work in industry tends to require a great deal of overtime, engineers have to travel a lot, and traveling a lot and having to work overtime are exactly the things that women don't want to have to do, because they want to have children and they can't combine. There are all kinds of careers, it's said, with which you can combine child rearing, but engineering is not one of them. You may have gathered